The world after the fall was supposed to have descended into chaos. That was what they had all expected, scientists, politicians, doomsayers. The dead were walking, their relentless hunger consuming everything in their path. Society had already begun to crumble in the early weeks of the outbreak. But then, something changed. The military, once overwhelmed and teetering on the brink of collapse, managed to regroup. By sheer force and the brutal efficiency of their chain of command, they did what many thought impossible. They survived. Not just survived, they dominated. It started with the quarantine zones. Cities that Rick Grimes and his group might have passed by once, barren and devoid of life, had been turned into fortress states. Massive barriers of steel and concrete were erected around these zones, and those lucky enough or unlucky enough to find themselves inside were subject to the military's iron grip. The soldiers didn't offer sanctuary. They imposed order. Life in these walled cities came at a price: absolute obedience. Martial law wasn't just an emergency state anymore. It was the law, the only law. "Line up!" barked a soldier, his voice slicing through the cold morning air. His camo uniform was immaculate, his face devoid of emotion as he supervised the line of haggard civilians. Men, women, and children stood in tense silence, clutching meager belongings or staring at the dirt beneath their feet. The weekly ration drops had become the closest thing to salvation for the lucky few living within the perimeter of New Atlanta Quarantine Zone. But everyone knew there wasn't enough to go around. There was never enough. Near the back of the line, Daryl Dixon leaned against his crossbow. Their survival in the woods seemed like a distant memory now, another life entirely. His hair hung in greasy strands across his eyes, and his clothes carried the scent of damp and decay. "This ain't right," he muttered under his breath. Beside him, Carol leaned closer, her lips taut as she whispered, "Keep your voice down, Daryl. They've got ears everywhere." It had been Carol's idea to come to the quarantine zone. After Alexandria fell, after yet another failed attempt at building something real, the group had fractured. Carol thought they needed structure, somewhere safe, even if that safety came with shackles. But Daryl hated this place, hated what it had done to them. It wasn't survival, it was subjugation. At the front of the line, a woman screamed. Daryl's head snapped up. A soldier grabbed the woman's arm, his fingers digging into her pale skin as she tried to argue. "You don't have clearance. Your number's not on the manifest," he growled. The woman's son, a boy no older than 10, clutched her hand tightly, his tear-streaked face twisted in fear. She begged, pleaded, pointing to the child. "He's my son. He needs food. Please, just let him have it." The soldier didn't hesitate. With practiced ease, he pulled the boy from her grasp and shoved them both aside. The woman collapsed to her knees, her cries drowned by the surrounding silence. As the line shuffled forward as if nothing had happened, Carol winced, looking away, but Daryl's jaw tightened. "This is their protection," he hissed. His knuckles whitened around the handle of his crossbow, his mind racing with violent thoughts. He didn't care if these grunts had body armor or assault rifles. He didn't care how many there were. All he needed was a quick shot at the bastard standing there in his polished boots. He took a step forward, but Carol grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered, her voice low but firm. She locked eyes with him, her worry clear. "You'll get us both killed. The others too." That was the other problem with the quarantine zone. Their group wasn't really a group anymore. Rick, Michonne, Maggie, none of them were here. Different factions of the military commanded different zones, and if the others even were present in one of these walled-off cities, there was no way to know for sure. The system thrived on separation and control. The military ruled with absolute authority, and defiance wasn't just met with punishment. It was erased. People who crossed the line weren't sent to some stockade or locked in a cell. No one ever saw them again. 3 weeks ago, Daryl had caught sight of a man who mouthed off to a commanding officer. The next morning, that same man had been strung up like a warning over the perimeter wall, feeding the dead on the outside. And the worst part? No one inside had batted an eye. The wolves didn't just live outside the walls anymore. They were wearing helmets and carrying assault rifles. But not all was as secure as the authorities claimed. Rumors spread through the zone like whispers of a ghost. Stories of an underground resistance. They called themselves the Hollow Guard, a scattered network of civilians, deserters, and even defected military officers who refused to bow to the new regime. And Daryl and Carol had been watching, waiting, listening. The trouble was, finding the Hollow Guard meant risk. A step too close to suspicion and goodbye. But Daryl couldn't take this place much longer. A horn echoed through the encampment, sharp and startling. Civilians instinctively shrank back, their eyes darting to the armed soldiers who immediately began barking orders. Daryl stared past the mass of people toward the distant watchtowers. From his angle, he could see the sparks of movement, more guards being sent out. Another line of vehicles rumbling toward the outer gate. "What's going on?" Carol whispered, her usual calm cracking. She followed his gaze to the wall. Beyond it, the faint howls of walkers grew louder, a hollow, unsettling sound carried by the wind. The horn wasn't an ordinary warning. Something was wrong. "Reckon we're about to find out," Daryl muttered. Tension rippled through the air. The soldiers pointed their rifles outward, forming ranks. Civilians were corralled toward the inner sector by groups of barking guards. Daryl caught sight of a solitary figure in an officer's uniform stepping onto one of the higher platforms overlooking the walls. The man's rigid posture signaled authority, his voice amplified by a crude megaphone. "Citizens of New Atlanta," his voice boomed, "this zone has been compromised by unauthorized activity. Effective immediately, all sectors will be placed under lockdown. Obey your orders, and you will remain secure." Carol froze, her face pale. "Compromised? What do you think that means?" Daryl's expression darkened. "Means trouble." His fingers flexed restlessly against the familiar weight of his crossbow. The guards were already closing in, corralling the crowd like cattle. Something was wrong. More than just the walkers outside the walls. His gut told him this wasn't just another breach. This felt deliberate, coordinated. The crowd erupted into chaos as gunfire echoed from somewhere near the western sector. People screamed, scattering like panicked birds. Daryl grabbed Carol by the arm, pulling her into a nearby alley. They crouched low, hearts pounding as shadows danced irregularly across the cracked pavement. "Stay quiet," he hissed. Carol nodded, her breath shallow. From the other end of the alley, they could see the chaos unfolding. Fleeing civilians collapsed under the weight of their desperation, and soldiers barked madly to regain control. But there was something else. A group of figures slipping through the cracks, unnoticed by the guards. Civilians? No, they moved too deliberately, and then Daryl spotted it. A distinct patch sewn onto one of their jackets, the outline of a cracked shield. The Hollow Guard. Without hesitation, Daryl made a decision. He stood, motioning to Carol. "Come on," he said. For a moment, she hesitated, searching his face. But she trusted him. Above the roar of gunfire and the groans of the undead battering the perimeter, the two darted toward the shadows where the Hollow Guard had vanished. As they ran, Daryl's mind raced. He didn't know if this path would lead to salvation or a worse hell. But staying inside the walls wasn't survival anymore. If the military thought they could bring back the world by stomping out what was left of freedom, they were wrong. These fortress cities didn't protect anyone. All they did was trade one kind of monster for another. The shadows wrapped around them like a second skin, the narrow alleys providing temporary cover from the chaos erupting in New Atlanta. Daryl moved with the practiced silence of a predator, his crossbow at the ready, eyes darting to every potential threat. Carol stayed close, her breathing steady despite the storm of uncertainty swirling in her mind. The sound of distant gunfire mixed with the guttural groans of walkers filtering through the cracks in the perimeter wall. It was a symphony of death, a grim reminder of what waited on the other side. "You sure about this?" Carol asked in a low whisper, her voice barely audible as they crept toward the corner where the figures had disappeared. Her hand brushed against the knife at her belt, a reminder that she was still ready to fight, though she wasn't sure who her enemies were anymore. "Ain't no guarantees anymore," Daryl replied without looking back. his voice carrying that quiet stubbornness she knew all too well. But those people, they ain't just shooting in the dark. They got a plan. Hell, maybe it's time we start finding one too. The alley opened into a larger courtyard, one obscured from the view of the main thoroughfares by collapsed storefronts and the skeletal remains of rusted vehicles. Daryl spotted movement ahead. A figure crouched beside a shattered dumpster. The cracked shield patch gleamed faintly in the low light. Daryl raised his crossbow but held his fire. He'd learned over the years to balance instinct with caution, and he wasn't looking to waste a bolt unless he had to. "Hey!" he called out in a gruff whisper. The figure froze, their head snapping toward him. A woman emerged from the shadows, her face streaked with grime, her eyes sharp and calculating. She held a pistol by her side, but she didn't raise it, at least not yet. "You with them?" she asked, her voice hard, her words cutting through the tension with surgical precision. She flicked her chin toward the direction of the chaos behind them, where the soldiers barked orders like wolf pack alphas trying to corral a herd. "Not hardly," Daryl replied, lowering his crossbow slightly but keeping his grip firm. Carol stepped up behind him, her gaze wary but searching. "We ain't with no one. Not anymore." The woman studied them, her finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. Trust was a commodity in short supply, and every second felt like the flick of a lighter next to a leaking gas line. Finally, she lowered the pistol just enough to shift the atmosphere. "You've got 20 seconds, she said, her voice edged with urgency. "Tell me why I shouldn't just walk away right now." Daryl locked eyes with her, his jaw tightening as years of buried frustration boiled to the surface. "'Cause this place?" He jerked his thumb back toward the heart of the quarantine zone. "Ain't no different than bein' dead already. You got your little outfit hollow guard, right? I ain't stupid. I seen the way you're movin'. You ain't just runnin' scared like the rest of 'em." He took a step closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "You fightin' back? Then maybe it's time we talk. Maybe it's time you got some help." The woman blinked, her steely expression faltering for just a second. Then she looked past him to Carol, scrutinizing her with the same predator's precision. Carol met her gaze without flinching. "He's right," Carol said, her voice calm but resolute. "We've been watching, waiting, sick of breathing air that ain't free." The woman hesitated, her fingers tightening around her pistol, before finally nodding. "Follow me, and keep quiet. You slip up, and it's both our heads on spikes." They moved quickly, weaving through unseen passages and forgotten corners of the quarantine zone where the military's grasp had loosened. Daryl counted 3 more figures joining them, all bearing the same shield patch. This wasn't some ragtag motley of scared survivors. These people moved like a unit, coordinated, purposeful. One of them, a lanky man with a buzz cut, carried what looked like a repurposed radio transmitter slung over his back. "What's with all the noise back there?" Daryl murmured as he fell into step beside the first woman, his curiosity clawing at the edges of his restraint. "The breach? That you?" She shot a sideways glance at him, her lips twitching in something between a sneer and a smirk. "You're quick, I'll give you that much. It's not just walkers out there anymore," she said grimly. "Your friends in the military like to keep secrets, but they ain't so good at tying up their loose ends. Some of their mistakes have started catching up to them, and to us." "Mistakes?" Carol asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though the weight of the question pressed heavily in the air. "You'll see soon enough," the woman replied cryptically, quickening her pace. They slipped through a reinforced door hidden behind the remnants of an old toy store. The space beyond wasn't much to look at. A dimly lit, claustrophobic room strewn with scavenged supplies and weapons. Maps of the quarantine zone and its surrounding regions were pinned to the walls, lines of red ink crisscrossing the paper like veins through bleeding flesh. Daryl caught sight of crude diagrams that appeared to detail structural weaknesses in the military's defenses. "Reckon you've been busy," Daryl said, his tone half appraising, half suspicious. Buzzcut stepped forward, tossing his transmitter onto the table. "Not busy enough. That breach wasn't just some distraction. It was supposed to shut down their comms grid. He turned to the woman, frustration bleeding into his voice. "You said they handled our signal jammers." "They did," she snapped back. "But the dead keep marching anyway, because that's what they do." Carol stepped forward, her intuition sharp as ever. "What mistakes? What aren't we seeing?" Her calm exterior had given way to something colder now, a controlled fury radiating through her clipped words. The woman hesitated, then walked to one of the maps and jabbed a finger at a section labeled Sector G, Petrified Forest. "Out there," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It started with the breaches. They've been experimenting for years now, using walkers trying to weaponize the infection. It's how they've kept control outside the walls." Fear. Her hand curled into a fist. But some of those experiments went bad. No way to hide it anymore. Daryl cursed under his breath, leaning against the edge of the table. "Weaponized walkers," he muttered. The thought made his skin crawl. It wasn't just the undead they were fighting now. It was the twisted hand of humanity bending nature into something worse. Before the weight of that revelation could settle, a sharp knock rattled the door. Everyone froze, instincts sharpening like blades. The woman signaled for absolute silence, and her team readied their weapons in eerie unison. The door opened, and for a brief moment, the flickering light of the hallway framed a familiar silhouette. A figure stepped inside, their face hidden under a hood. Daryl's breath hitched as they pulled it back. "Michonne," Carol whispered, her voice cracking. The katana-wielding warrior's expression was both familiar and alien, hardened in ways they hadn't seen before. She didn't speak, but her eyes darted across the room, taking inventory in mere seconds. When her gaze settled on Daryl, there was a flicker of something. Relief? Pain? Regret? It vanished before it could take root. "I got your signal," she said finally, directing her words to the woman. Her voice was low, almost mechanical, but her presence sucked the air out of the room. "You've got a breach, and I suggest you deal with it soon, or this zone will fall." Buzzcut grabbed his transmitter, his panic barely concealed. "What breach?" he asked frantically. "Sector G was secure. We made sure." "It's not secure anymore," Michonne interrupted. "And it's not coming from outside the walls." Her gaze flicked to Daryl and Carol again, her expression unreadable. "You thought the military was the biggest threat? It gets worse." The room descended into a taut silence as the weight of her words took hold. The undead outside were relentless, yes. The Hollow Guard could fight their battle against the soldiers ruling the zones, sure. But the infection. If Michonne was right, if something else had crept under their skin within the very walls they chose to hide behind, then we're all already dead, Daryl muttered darkly. The silence stretched across the room, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the transmitter. Daryl's fingers tightened around the strap of his crossbow, his every instinct telling him to move, to act. But Michonne's words had hit harder than any walker ever could. "If it's not coming from outside the walls," Carol said, her voice carefully measured, though her eyes betrayed her fear, "then what are we dealing with? What did the military do? What did they let in?" Michonne stepped forward, her katana gleaming faintly in the dim light. "It's not about what they let in," she said, her gaze sweeping over the maps plastered on the walls. "It's about what's already here. Sector breaches, quarantine failures, they're symptoms, not accidents. They've been losing control of their own nightmare for a long time. And now it's spreading." The room bristled with tension. The woman with the cracked shield patch, still clutching her pistol, spoke. "You're saying there's something inside the quarantine zones? What, some kind of new infection?" Her voice barely masked the tremor beneath her hardened exterior. "Not just an infection," Michonne said coldly, her gaze locking onto the woman's. Her words came deliberate, like each one carried the weight of its own funeral. "It's adaptation. Call it evolution or call it corruption, whatever it is, it's smarter and it's learning. They've been twisting this world for so long they've made something they can't put down anymore." A pause, then, with venom, "You want to know your enemy? Look in the mirror." Daryl let out a low breath, his stomach twisting. He glanced at Carol, who seemed locked in her own battle to keep her composure. It was almost easier back when the world was black and white. Survive or die, kill or be killed. But now every shadow held a potential weapon pointed at their backs. "You're saying they created something worse than walkers," Daryl said, his voice low, almost daring Michonne to confirm it. "Something we can't outrun this time." Michonne gave a slow nod, then turned to the maps and diagrams on the wall. Her finger traced over a red line marking one of the weak points in the military's defensive perimeter. "Sector G wasn't just an accident," she said. "No one loses a stronghold that important unless they're covering something up. And the kind of thing they're hiding. Yeah, it's worse. The infection out there, that's the wilderness. But in here, they're farming it." The room plunged even deeper into silence. Buzzcut, unable to hold his tongue any longer. That's insane," he hissed. "If the military was doing something like that, risking all their zones, the whole system would collapse." Carol shot him a cold look. "Does it look stable to you?" she snapped, the edge in her voice cutting through the air like broken glass. "How long have you been scraping by in these hidden spaces, barely surviving under their boots? How many more breaches are you willing to gamble your life on before you admit something's wrong?" Daryl stepped forward then, angling himself toward Michonne. His voice came out rough and sharp. "Tell me something straight. Are we talking walkers with teeth? Or something else? 'Cause I've seen a lot of things out there, but you're talking like there's something we ain't met yet." Michonne's lips pressed into a hard line. For a moment, her silence seemed more deadly than any answer she could give. Finally, she said, "It's not just walkers. It's something worse. They're faster. They think. I saw one take down a man not with numbers or strength, but with tactics." Her clenched fist trembled as her voice dipped just above a whisper. "The military has been experimenting with them, trying to train them, to make the apocalypse their weapon." The words shuddered through the room, leaving no air for doubt or denial. The woman with the cracked shield patch cursed under her breath and shoved her pistol into its holster, pacing as if movement could shake off the weight of reality. "If these things can think, you're not talking about survival anymore. You're talking annihilation." Carol crossed her arms over her chest, her voice unrelenting. "And those barricades? Those soldiers? They won't be enough to stop something like that. They're too busy controlling the living to worry about the dead." "Exactly," Michonne said, her voice harder now, steadier. She pointed at the largest map dominating the wall. "Their arrogance is their biggest weakness. They think the zones will hold no matter what. They think the chain of command will keep them safe. But this world doesn't care about their commands or their walls." Her eyes burned as she turned her gaze on the group. "If we don't act now, we'll all just be fuel for the fire when it spreads." "So what's the plan?" Daryl asked, cutting through the weight of the conversation like a blade. His voice carried an edge of finality, a signal that whatever route they were taking, he was already committed. "You got your hollow guard, your radios, your signals, but that ain't gonna mean squat against something that learns how to hunt back." The woman with the cracked shield stopped pacing, planting her feet firmly. "We evacuate," she said, a grim determination filling her voice. "Not just this zone. All of them. We've been working on an underground network for months now, smuggling people out past the military barricades into the wilderness. The zones aren't salvation anymore. They're slaughterhouses waiting to happen." "And then what?" Carol challenged, her tone sharp. "You pull people out, but where do they go? Back into the wild? The wild's where this started." "One fight at a time," the woman snapped. "We save who we can. After that, we take the fight to the ones pulling the strings. We burn their labs, their supply chains, and we make damn sure they can't farm any more nightmares." Daryl chewed the inside of his cheek, considering her words. It was reckless. It was suicidal. But as he felt the weight of the crossbow hanging against his back, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the direction they should have been moving in instead of rotting behind these walls. "Still don't trust you," he muttered, though his words lacked venom. But if y'all have a way out, I ain't gonna sit here waiting to be the next experiment. Buzzcut exchanged a look with the woman. He looked like he was about to argue, then shook his head, deciding against it. The tunnels, he said reluctantly. They'd be the safest route. We reinforce the routes that lead to the surface, keep the grid offline as long as possible. If we're lucky, we'll be miles out before the soldiers realize we've gone. Michonne was already inspecting the crude maps, her hands tracing the paths marked in black ink. How secure are these tunnels? She asked. Walkers don't care about walls, and what you're describing isn't just walkers anymore. The woman hesitated before answering. We've cleared what we can, but there's always risks we can't account for. Her gaze sharpened. Why? You volunteering to clear the rest? Michonne's eyes steeled. If that's what it takes. Carol watched her old friend carefully, the conversation swirling around her like a hurricane. But this wasn't the Michonne she remembered. Her movements were as fluid and sure as ever, but the light behind her eyes had taken on a darker shade, one bent toward purpose instead of hope. Carol already knew that if they took this path, none of them would make it out clean. Outside, the sounds of chaos grew louder. The combination of walkers, panic-stricken civilians, and the military's thunderous weaponry painting a picture of the storm already waiting beyond the thin veneer of safety. Whatever the Hollow Guard was planning, there was no time for debate. Daryl spoke, his voice carving through the tension with absolute finality. When do we move? The woman glanced at Buzzcut, then at the others from her group who had silently gathered at the edges of the room. Her expression was tight, her jaw clenched. Tonight, she said. Once the main gates fall, the soldiers will be too busy holding back the flood to notice us moving through the tunnels. You sure the gates are gonna fall? Carol asked, her skepticism sharp. Michonne answered before the woman could. They will, she said, her tone bleak and certain. Her katana hung at her side like an executioner's blade. Whatever's outside that wall, it's not stopping. And when it breaks through, this whole zone is done for. Daryl nodded, his expression grim. He turned to Carol. Ain't no other choice, Carol. Not anymore. She looked at him for a long moment, their silent understanding bridging the gap between despair and resolve. Finally, she nodded, though the weight of it looked like it might crush her. Then let's finish this. Outside, the first screams of the breach echoed through the zone like the tolling of a funeral bell. Walking Dead poured in through widening cracks in the barriers, but they weren't the only ones. Among them moved shadows that ignored the chaos, their figures almost human but distinctly wrong. Faster, smarter, the fight to survive hadn't ended. It had only just evolved. And this time, it wasn't the dead they feared most. It was the monsters the living had created in their place.